Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm your host, Amanda Lamb. In today's deep dive conversation with WRAL's hidden history reporter, Heather Leah, we're talking about the history of the Pride movement here in North Carolina in honor of Pride Month. Specifically, Heather is going to give us a behind-the-scenes look at some of the first businesses that created safe spaces for the LGBTQIA plus community to gather. Heather, welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So if you take a stroll, let's face it, anywhere in downtown Raleigh, but especially the Warehouse District, you see rainbow flags everywhere. You see all our welcome signs. But that has not always been the case. So tell me what it was like for this community not that long ago.
Yeah, so I was fortunate to come of age in the late 90s, early 2000s, where things were a little different. But when you talk to members of the LGBTQIA plus community who came of age in the 60s and 70s here in Raleigh, it was very different. So I'm sure you have noticed that a lot of the gay clubs, Legends, Flex, the CC, which isn't there anymore, but it used to be, a lot of those places are in the Warehouse District, as you said. And the reason for that was because back when they were built, the LGBT community was pushed to the edge of the city. It was for two reasons, from what I understand. It was that, A, the larger population didn't want to have to see the LGBT community, and so they were kind of pushed out. But also, it was not safe. This was a time, especially the 60s, and you think about the first Pride, which was an uprising, and it was because of policing and police actually coming in to gay clubs and trying to arrest members of the LGBT community and harm them. So they would go to the edge of the community for safety. You can notice even today, I always wondered, I went to Legends a lot growing up, and in my younger days, not growing up, and the windows are blocked off. Well, back in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, early 90s.
There was fear of some type of retaliation
Right.
or something that could happen to them.
Yeah, you didn't want to have your identity seen. You could be fired from your job, or worse, you could be harmed, right?
And I know, we think today it's so easy to communicate, obviously, with the internet, with email, with text messaging, with cell phones. But back then, it was really hard for people in this community to connect and communicate with one another. So how did businesses help facilitate that?
So there were actually, this blew my mind. So this information comes from people who grew up in Raleigh during that time period who were members of the LGBT community. They told me that there were secret codes. Some of these businesses, they would put one single bare bulb in front of their front door, and like a light bulb, and that would let you know that that was a safe space for you, because you couldn't be very open about it. You had to know where you could gather safely. There were fortunately newsletters. The front page was a newsletter, and then later in the 90s there was White Rabbit Books and Things, which had a bulletin board. And these were very important because these would allow you to find resources. Let's say in the 80s, in the height of the AIDS crisis, you need to know where you can go get testing. You need to know where you can go get care. I spoke to someone who grew up in the 80s. She told me half her friends died before she was 30 years old, and it was all of AIDS. It was mysterious. It was scary. They didn't know what was happening. So how do you communicate when imagine COVID if we couldn't talk to each other? So these message boards and these newsletters
became vital and critical for that communication.
That's right.
Well, we're going to talk about some of these specific businesses after the break. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. So let's talk about some of these early gathering places. I know the first gay bar, or what was considered the first gay bar, was the Mousetrap, 2 doors down from the famous Rialto Theater. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so that, again, the Mousetrap was the first known gay bar in Raleigh. It opened in the 70s, according to paperwork. Now, what I have been told is the paperwork may not completely be accurate, because some places that were going to be bars and gathering spaces for the LGBT community, they were nervous about putting it out there what they existed for, right? Because they were worried if the city knows, are they going to be policed? Are people going to come harm them? But from what we know, it was the 1970s. And that building is still there today, right beside the Rialto. I think it's 2 doors down. So the Mousetrap building is still there. And I do want to mention, as we talk about these places, there is not one historic landmark in Raleigh that is based on the history of the LGBTQIA plus community.
So there's nothing commemorating that. You just have to know.
You just have to know.
Right.
And so that's why we want to talk about where some of these locations were and where they are today so you can see them.
White Rabbit Books and Things was on Hargett Street, and I actually have been here since the 90s, so I remember it was there at that time. Tell me about what that place was and what it is today.
So today it is High Tide Salon, and there's actually a mural like in the back of the store that they uncovered, possibly from when it was White Rabbit, but possibly from even before that. But the cool hidden mural back there. Also some hidden books and things that they found. But White Rabbit was one of the first gathering spaces for the LGBT community that was not a bar, right? And so it was unfortunate if you were an LGBT teen, you couldn't go to these bars. You couldn't go to these gathering spaces. You wouldn't be able to access these resources. White Rabbit was someplace you could go and begin to learn about your community. I did speak to one woman who told me, I think she was 16 when she went in there, and she said it was the first time she saw products that were made for her, that were targeting her, that reflected her experiences. And she bought, like, I think a little rainbow music box and brought it home with her. And it was, like, so meaningful to her because she hadn't ever been able to buy anything that reflected who she was in that way. It was very emotional for a lot of young people to be able to go there. And I do know the owner of the store, he's quoted as saying, he actually made it, he says he made it gayer the further back you got so that if the general public came in, they wouldn't get too alarmed.
Right.
But if you went further back, there would be more obvious products and things like that the LGBT community might be interested in. And again, that's his quote.
Yeah, I remember it actually just being a really, neat bookstore and had, gifts and cards and things like that. So, obviously very significant in the history of the Pride movement. Tell me about the mural and the book, because I do find that fascinating.
Yeah, so I went there last year to do a story on the White Rabbit Books and Things, and they uncovered this incredibly detailed mural. I don't know how to describe it. It's like a bunch of little murals all stuck together. It looks like almost like an advent calendar. It's not, but if you can imagine an advent calendar and every little door has like a little person inside, that's kind of what it looked like. And then there's like one big person in the middle. And then up way in a corner by the ceiling, this little crevice, they had reached in there and found a little notebook. And the little book had like poetry written in it and things like that. And we do wonder if, especially the book, might be some kind of remnant. It seems like it was very intentionally tucked away. And so we do wonder if that might be a remnant from someone back in the 90s who put that there. I do just want to quickly add, other than White Rabbit Books and Things, which again, you can see that building today, it's High Tide Salon. And then there's the Mousetrap. I do want to add, there was also, of course, Legends, which is still there, Flex. And while Flex is an LGBT bar and has had to move because the building that it was originally in is being torn down, there was also the Fallout Shelter, which was not an overt LGBTQIA space. However, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, it was a safe space. So you could go there and be open about who you were. And a lot of the people who used to hang out there for their industrial nights moved to Legends when the Fallout Shelter closed, which Legends is where I spent, my 20s and coming of age time. So,
and there's so much development, so many things changing. It's my understanding that the site where Legends is now is also going to be a site for development, and that Legends will be moving to another location. Are you seeing more safe spaces, less safe spaces? Are there enough safe spaces?
That's a complicated question because I think in general, more places are safe overall. However, I'm also seeing as spaces that were carved out for the LGBT community are being taken away. They're being developed over or moved or shuffled, and none of them are being recognized historically. I do want to give credit where it's due. The city of Raleigh did a historic context study. And this is because I want to mention this. When we talk about the history of the LGBTQIA plus community, a lot of it is oral history. It's people sharing their memories. A lot of this isn't written down because you weren't very open about it. It wasn't safe to be. And the people who remember it, some of them would have died in the AIDS crisis, right? And then some of them are not comfortable talking about it because they grew up in a time where you could not be out safely. And you could argue even today there's a danger in being out, but it was I would argue much more dangerous back then. So some of them aren't comfortable talking about it even today. So this history, it's easy to lose, and it's an important history.
To be passed down orally.
To be passed down. And the city did collect these oral histories and kind of notated these spots that are important to the LGBT community. And I'm hoping, I'd love to see some landmarks happen, so that at least if these places get torn down or moved
there will be some reminders.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, Heather, once again, thank you so much for giving us the behind-the-scenes peek into the history of the Pride movement here in Raleigh. If you're listening to this podcast on WRAL.com or the WRAL app, you can find it on any podcast app, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, anywhere podcasts live. You'll find more episodes of the WRAL Daily Download. Thank you so much for listening.